I am so excited to have you here. I am your host, Stephanie Kendall. I appreciate all your likes, your subscribes, your shares. And of course, I want to hear from you. I want your comments. I want your suggestions. And Connor is here to talk about some things. And I am so excited to have him here. He's talking about the same things I'm talking about. He is a college professor. Welcome to the show, Connor. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Stephanie. I'm very excited to be on today and to speak with you and the audience.
Your teachings, your realm is very much aligned with my show's realm. Tell us what your expertise is.
Yeah, I'm a professor who in American studies, which means I study American culture, American history, and American politics. I sort of have my expertise in immigration and indigenous peoples. So I work with different groups on campus to advocate for indigenous rights programs and also to advocate for immigrant groups.
Now, do they allow you to do so still? Being quite
uh,
frank.
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? I think the current administration is very openly hostile to higher education, as you've seen in the news from their freezing of grants and their dismantling of funders for education. But also, a lot of times they're targeting specific people in our system, right? International student and immigrants, trans folks and other queer folks who are now more worried about their rights and about their ability to talk about just who they are and to exist and to criticize even, the government or any aspect of society that they want, which they should have the right to do under the First Amendment.
How are they feeling the effects? How are you seeing the effects of these policies in place affecting the students that you're speaking of, the marginalized students?
I think first thing so we saw it's hitting different strands of students and different students in different ways. The first group that we really saw the Trump administration push on was the international student community, right? Trump has revoked 2,000 plus visas for international students. We have about 1 million international students in the US, and the government is revoking their status without often warning or reason. Normally, if you get your visa revoked, someone says something about it.
So let's clarify how they're going about this. Like, what is the process? Is there a process that they're going about doing this?
Not really. I mean, the Trump administration is like very stereotypical, break stuff and then figure it out later. You know,
Yeah, very much so. So they're just
yeah.
targeting students based off.
Oftentimes, if they have been critical of the Trump administration, a lot of times it seems to be people from specific ethnic and religious backgrounds, students from places that the Trump administration doesn't like, the Middle East, China, places like that. And those students, usually what would happen is that if they were being told their visa was being revoked, they would be given like information and the school would be given a heads up in advance, but that hasn't been the case. And I know in Maryland, we had a bunch of our student visas revoked. In my school, we had four of them. And the administration didn't tell the school. The only reason the school found out is because they checked the visa status of their students every day. If they hadn't have done that, no one would have known that those students were getting their
Wow.
visas revoked.
Wow. So the students weren't notified, the school wasn't notified.
No, and the thing about that is they could have, if the school wasn't so proactive in looking, right? Those students would have been walking around for days, potentially weeks, having had their visas revoked, and then that could have led to
Strong
arrest.
arm,
Yeah,
basically.
and
Yeah.
so these students, often many of them, in some of our cases, and in a lot of other schools, some of them were only a week or two away from graduating anyway, and their visa was revoked before they could graduate. And the school was like, "Can we graduate these students? Can they finish class? Do they have to
Can
go
they
home
get their
right
money
now?"
back?
Yeah, exactly. If they can't,
How does the school handle this? How do higher ups in the schools in your institution handle this?
well, I think a lot of them were taken by surprise. We always knew the Trump administration was going to be hostile to universities. The conservative movement in general has, been hostile. They're always talking about how the university system is full of communists who are turning your kids trans and this type of stuff, college professors who are doing all that, which is really funny to me as a professor because I think like Fox News thinks I can turn students trans. And I'm like, I can't even get them to do the reading. Like,
You can't even get them to do their homework, much less.
yeah, like, I'm like,
This
what are you
is
talking about?
yeah, yes.
They've been pushing this anti education language. Universities are full of communism and feminism and DEI and all of this stuff. You hear people like DeSantis in Florida saying that and signing laws like the Don't Say Gay bill, which is an attack on the ability to teach about gender. We also see him banning DEI, and Trump has been instituting these on a national level.
Let's talk more about that, the whole DEI. And that's something that was like one of his first shutdowns.
Yeah,
How does that affect him?
Yeah, the DEI policies that they're attacking, first of all, it's mostly a boogeyman. There's no real, what they're trying to do is attack communities of students and scholars who disagree with them and their worldview, right? And again, you've seen this with Trump, his bans on DEI, quote unquote, was recently in the news because Columbia University had made a deal with Trump in terms of he had frozen $400 million of their federal grants. And he told them one of the ways they could get that money back is by like cutting their DEI programs. And well, saying like you can't do DEI in admissions or any of that stuff. It's like a bribery scheme in a way, right? It's like you can have your money, but you have to do what I say, right?
As a bargaining chip.
Yeah, yeah. And what happens a lot of the times in this is that the law or the executive order or whatever it is written very broadly. And so it's written that way intentionally so that it gives the administration the maximum capacity to prosecute things that they don't like or to push.
Loopholes.
Yeah. And what that does is it silences academics who are, and universities, because universities don't want to be sued or deal with what Columbia was dealing with. And so they will get rid of things that Trump doesn't like to stop that.
To keep their money.
Yeah, and I've seen that in
Let
my own life with my one of my colleagues who was supposed to go to Florida and give a speech in Florida about indigenous studies and sort of settler colonialism. They were invited to a university by the university. And then after DeSantis made his changes to DEI and gender studies and those things to attack them, he was basically the school basically called her up and said like, "Hey, we don't really know if we want you to come anymore because we might get sued." And I weirdly had a similar situation where I was doing Irish Heritage Month, St. Patty's Day, being an Irish immigrant. And I got invited to talk about it at a school, what Irish immigration was like. And they were like, yeah, we would normally do this through our Office of Diversity. But because of that, we don't want to call it a diversity thing because it might get us in trouble. So they also told me to be careful about what I say, right? Which is like stifling the speech of academics. And even on things like Irish immigration, which, Irish people being white people and European people, you would think that that would be a safe subject for a administration that is a white supremacist administration. But all the schools are so worried about getting sued or dealing with that bargaining chip that they don't end up doing anything or they get afraid of doing anything. Yeah.
like okay, let's just go ahead and get it out there right now that this administration, like you said, a white supremacy administration, wants their constituents to be stupid. They want to keep them ignorant.
I think so. With the attacks on majors that they don't like, particularly the humanities and the arts, which are the ones that sort of teach more critical thinking, but also things like empathy, compassion, ability to contextualize historical and political events. Those are a big part of the humanities. And when you get rid of those, it quarantines people off into their groups, and creates more segregated, less critical societies.
So, I mean, those of us in the real world know that a lot of this comes from lack of critical thinking. We know that this is a lack of education. What is the role that institutions play in teaching critical thinking skills? Do they teach critical thinking skills?
I think the university has traditionally been a place where students can go and be critical thinkers and speak their mind. It hasn't always lived up to that ability as much as it could, or it hasn't translated that into a public position as much, right? Bringing that knowledge that they're giving young people and bringing it to a public community, right? And the broader community in general. So I think they do want to teach critical thinking. I think that the issue is that
They
they
want to, they cannot
yeah,
any
they can.
longer.
Yeah, they cannot. And the other thing is that the money aspect is a big part of this because universities, while we want them to be places of higher education where people can go and like fill their intellectual curiosity, are also businesses. And if the money starts getting attacked, they're going to try to protect their ability to exist, which means that they have to like cut stuff, even though I don't think most administrations want to do that. Although
They're
I wish,
forced into that position.
yeah, exactly. And you see it with, like I said, Columbia University making their deal. They basically signed a pledge that said that they would ban consideration of race in admissions and hiring and clamp down on campus protests and cooperate with the Trump administration in terms of like their Department of the Middle East. And you've seen it with places like in Florida, where 14 colleges in Florida are working to help ICE find students.
I've got to ask you, let's get to the heart of issues and let's not beat around the bush here. I want to ask you, do you see white students
Mhm.
buying into this whole administration, their whole thinking?
Um, I think there's certainly a percentage of students who believe in those ideals. It's a very small group in terms of colleges, right? Most of the people who end up in colleges tend to be more liberal leaning, younger. They have a critical thinking from their time at college that helps them sort of question things about these stereotypes and ideas that they have, but there are certainly a lot more visible young students engaging in this type of rhetoric than there necessarily has been over the last 10 years. Like a lot of young students probably do come in thinking that international students have taken American spots or something like that. But they meet international students and they interact with international students and they see that international students are in their classes and they realize, like, oh, these guys are just like folks trying to get an
So do you
education.
see a lot of them changing their perspective?
I think usually you do see. I mean, there are not that many. Like I said, the amount of people who would be sort of overtly Trumpian in nature in college is not that high. But you do see a lot of people who change their perspective once they meet other people. A lot of people who maybe were anti-trans or maybe not anti-trans, but just didn't understand it, who meet trans people and then become more aware, and that story expands the story of America. People might get uncomfortable a little bit, but it doesn't. The uncomfortable part of that makes you grow, and it doesn't, like, it's not something that the Trump administration is seeing that as a negative, but in reality, it's a positive because it makes the story
Absolutely.
more interesting, right?
It makes it real, like it's
Yeah.
real. You have to know the history of your nation, your people, the real history. So now that's another thing. Do you see that people are knowledgeable in real history, or is it have they been fed fake history?
Yeah, most history people who come in, I think, in general, tend to be like, or most people who come into my history classes in general tend to have a very narrow scope of American history, and they have
That's sad.
a narrow scope of American culture, and they don't necessarily understand how these things work, right? And so when I teach my students about immigration and they see how the Irish were treated, and then they see how people from South and Central America are treated today, they're shocked to see that the arguments made about the Irish are more or less the same, and that the arguments, like, it's their they're alien to our culture, their religion is different, they don't understand democracy, and these are all things that people say about immigrants from other countries today that they also said about the Irish and that they also said about the Italians. Or if you look at, like, a lot of my students don't realize that when the Civil War was going on, and you probably know more about this than many because you live out in the Midwest and the West, is that the Indian Wars were going on, right? And there were Native American people fighting against the U.S. and even against the Confederacy at the time of the Civil War too.
I have always been interested in history, and I learned way more from reading books than I did ever in school.
Yeah, you know, it's one of those things that people don't realize they're missing until they're missing it, right? A lot of my students will be like taking my classes as gen eds, and they'll learn about American history in a way they've never like discovered before, and they're like,
How many students do you get that are like, "No, that's not right?"
I have a few students every so often who will be challenged by the material, and I
Mhm,
always give them the spot to like give their point of view across, and
mhm.
then I'll explain to them my point of view on why we're talking about this, right? So if we talk about Abraham Lincoln doing the mass execution of Native people in the 1860s, the
Mhm.
biggest mass execution in history, people are like, but Lincoln was great, and I'm like, in some ways Lincoln was great, and in other ways, especially with indigenous people, he wasn't very good. And it challenges them, and I'll always try to let them have their space. And if they can make an argument for why they're right, I'm always happy to hear it.
Yeah, you gotta give people their platform. Right, right, right.
Yeah, but the issue usually is that, again, to be a historian, you're reading hundreds of history books. When I was doing my
Yeah.
comprehensive exams on history, I read 400 books, right? Uh, we read 400 of them for the tests, and then we come in with a knowledge base in the same way that a doctor. But like, students sometimes don't realize that, and they think
Yeah,
like,
we're right.
my history teacher
Like,
in
who
high
are
school taught
you?
me this. But I think what we
Yeah.
should do as educators is open ourselves up to being challenged, open ourselves up to students being there, and I try to keep things simple, like in terms of like, I do have my students look at, like, we have classes on gender, right? And one of the big attacks on American education right now is on our trans communities,
Trans, yeah.
right? And because my course is like partially history, partially like modern politics, when we talk about trans people, some students might have ideas about trans people in college and college sports. And I'll say, okay, how many people are in a college in college sports in the NCAA? And they're like, I don't know. And I'm like, about 500,000. And they're like, okay. And I'm like, and how many of those athletes are transgender, do you think, of the 500,000? And they're like, I don't know, 5,000? They're like, okay. What if it was less than that?
100?
Yeah. And then they're like, how many? And I'm like, 20 of 500,000. It's about,
20?
yeah, yeah, 20, right? And even the people who you do hear about, like if you were to listen to Fox News, you see students like Leah Thomas at Penn, who is a trans woman in the NCAA Division One swimming, and people will say that person was trans and they won a tournament, and therefore, like, they are. It shows how unfair this is. And so when we go through history of like gender, and I show them like trans people existed, here's some trans people from the 1800s, here's some trans people from the 1700s, they're
They're
shocked,
shocked.
because they're like, wait a minute.
Connor, I want to thank you so much for being on my show today.
Thank you so much for having me on here. I really appreciate it, and thank your audience for listening.